He kept a second coffee cup in the bottom drawer of his desk. Not the mug everyone saw him drink from, the chipped blue one that sat by the window, but a plain white cup, the kind you get free with a box of tea that he never once used in front of me. I found out about it by accident, 4 years in, when I was looking for a stapler. I didn't ask him about it. That was the rule between us, unspoken but absolute. If it mattered, you didn't ask. We had lunch every Thursday for 3 years. He was my boss. Nothing ever happened between us, not once, not even close, not in the way people mean when they ask that question with their eyebrows instead of their mouths. I want to say that clearly, at the start, because everything I'm about to tell you will sound. At certain points, like it's leading somewhere it never actually went. It didn't. That's the whole story, really. 3 years of Thursdays, and neither of us ever said the thing. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. If I tell you the middle first, you'll think you understand him, and you won't. You'll think you understand me, and you really won't. I've never told this whole thing to anyone, start to finish, in the right order, and I find now that I want to get it right, even if it's only for you. My name is Renata Castell. I was 26 when I met him, working as a junior architect at a mid-sized firm in Portland called Averill & Cho. 9 drafters, 3 partners, 1 very old freight elevator that groaned like it resented us. I'd been out of grad school 2 years, still paying off the degree, still learning that the drawings you make in school have almost nothing to do with the drawings that get built. I was good at my job. I want to say that too, early, because it matters later. I was good at my job before I ever knew him, and I stayed good at it after. He was 44. Thomas Holloway, principal architect, second name on the letterhead, the kind of quiet that some people mistake for coldness until they watch him listen to a junior staffer's idea for 4 full minutes without interrupting once. He'd hired me himself, out of a stack of maybe 60 portfolios. For a reason he told me on my first day and never really explained further. Your section drawings have joy in them. Most people's don't. That was it. That was the whole interview debrief. I went home and cried a little, the good kind, the kind where somebody sees something in your work you'd hoped was there and were afraid wasn't. He was married. I want to name that plainly too, right here, at the start, the way you'd name it if you were the one telling this story honestly instead of romantically. His wife's name was A.N.N. I'll leave her last name out of this, out of some old instinct toward privacy that I still have even now, and they'd been married 19 years when I started at the firm. There was a photo of her on his desk, next to the blue mug, taken somewhere with mountains behind her, laughing at something outside the frame. I looked at that photo more times over 3 years than I've probably looked at any single object in my life. Not with hatred, not even really with longing, most days. Just looking. Trying to understand the shape of a life I was standing at the edge of. The lunches started by accident, the way most rituals do before you notice they've become rituals. 6 weeks into the job, I was eating a sad container of leftover rice at my desk when he stopped by with a set of red-line drawings and said, "You eat like someone who doesn't know there's a good ramen place 2 blocks from here." I said, "I didn't know." He said, "Thursday, bring your notebook. I want to walk you through why I killed your stair detail." That was the first one. It was never framed as anything but professional development. For a long time, I believed that framing completely. But it kept happening. Every Thursday, without either of us ever formally deciding it would continue, for 3 years. Ramen, mostly. Or the Vietnamese place on the corner when the ramen place was too crowded. He always got the same thing, a bowl with soft-boiled egg he'd remove and eat first, before touching the noodles. A habit I found strange the first time and then, somewhere around year 2, found myself doing too. In my own kitchen. Alone, without deciding to. That was the first motif, if I can call it that, the egg first. Always. The second was smaller. He had a way of tapping 2 fingers once on the table. Just once. Right before he was about to say something he'd clearly been holding on to through the whole meal. I learned to watch for it. I learned that whatever came after that tap was the real reason we were there, and everything before it was runway. The third thing I noticed slower, because it took longer to see the pattern. He never once, in 3 years, asked me a question about my personal life that I hadn't opened the door to myself. He'd ask about a design problem, a client note, a book I'd mentioned once in October and remembered in March. He never asked if I was seeing anyone. He never asked why I sometimes came in on Mondays looking like I hadn't slept. He waited. Always, for me to bring it. If I wanted to bring it. I didn't understand until much later that this wasn't distance. It was the opposite of distance, disguised as manners. I need to be honest about the power gap here, because it's the whole shape of the thing, and I've spent enough years since then hearing people flatten stories like mine into something simpler than they were. He was my boss. He signed my performance reviews. He decided, in a very real sense, whether I kept getting work that let me pay my rent in a city that was getting more expensive every year I lived in it. I was 26, then 27, then 28. He was a married man in his mid-40s, with 2 teenagers and a mortgage and 19 years of a life built before I arrived in it. Neither of us ever pretended that gap wasn't there. We just built the whole friendship, if that's even the right word for it, in the narrow space beside it, careful never to lean on it. There was a period, I think it was the fall of my 2nd year, where I started noticing the way he'd look up when I walked past his office door, even when he was mid-conversation with someone else, even when the look lasted less than a second. I noticed the way he'd rewrite his own schedule so our Thursday lunch never got bumped by a client call, even when it would have been the easier thing to let it slide. I noticed, one late October evening, when we were the last 2 in the office finishing a competition submission, that he stood a half-step closer to me at the plotter than the task strictly required, and that neither of us moved. Priya, one of the other drafters, asked me about it directly once, in the break room, stirring her coffee in a way that made it clear she'd been building up to the question for a while. "You and Holloway," she said. "It's not, I know it's not anything. But it's something, right? The lunches. The way he gets when you're out sick." I remember exactly what I said, because I'd clearly rehearsed it without meaning to. He's a good mentor. I got lucky. Priya looked at me for a second too long and let it go. I've thought about that exchange more times than I can count. I gave her the true thing and the false thing in the same sentence, and I don't think I even noticed I was doing it at the time. Here is what I privately believed during those years, though I want to be honest that I was never certain, not even close to certain, and I think he'd say the same if he were the one telling this. I believed that he had built, somewhere in himself, a version of caring about me that he'd decided, consciously, deliberately, would never be allowed to become anything else. Not repressed. I don't think it was repression, exactly. I think he'd looked at it clearly, the way he looked at everything, and made a decision, and then kept remaking that same decision every single Thursday for 3 years, quietly, without ever needing me to help him make it. I believed that the lunches were, for him, a controlled amount of something he'd otherwise have denied himself completely. I believed, and this is the part I was least sure of, that some of what he felt toward me wasn't really about me at all, but about some version of himself at 26, before the mortgage and the letterhead and the 19 years, that he got to visit for 1 hour a week without having to explain to anyone why he needed to. I could be wrong about all of that. I want to say that plainly, because I never once asked him, and he never once told me, and everything I've just described is a story I built to live inside the silence. The way you do with someone you care about and can't interrogate. The obstacle was never a mystery, though, and I don't want to pretend it was, because that would make this sound more like fiction than it deserves to. The obstacle was Anne, and the 2 boys, and 19 years, and the plain fact that he was, whatever else he was to me, a decent man who had made vows and intended to keep them. He never once complained about his marriage to me. Not once. In 3 years did he say a disloyal word about her. If anything, he mentioned her more than he needed to, a habit I understood only later as its own kind of fence, built and maintained on purpose, brick by small brick, every single Thursday. There was one lunch, in the spring of my 3rd year, where the fence got tested without either of us choosing it. We'd stayed late reviewing a set of construction documents for a library branch we were both proud of, and when we finally stood up to leave, the office was dark except for the desk lamp, and it was raining hard enough that neither of us wanted to step outside yet. We stood by the window for a while, not talking, watching the street. He was close enough that I could have closed the distance in under a second, and I understood, with a kind of stillness I still remember, that he knew that too, and that we were both choosing, in real time, second by second, not to. Neither of us said anything about it afterward. We just picked up our bags when the rain slowed, and he held the door, and that was that. I didn't understand, that night, standing at the window, what any of it would cost either of us, or what it would eventually reveal. I only understood that something had been offered and declined by both of us at once, without a single word passing between us, and that this specific, quiet, mutual refusal was somehow the realest thing that had happened between 2 people I'd ever been part of. There's a scene from that 2nd year I haven't told you yet, because I've been circling it for as long as I've been telling this, and I think I have to stop circling now. It was February, the kind of Portland February that's really just one long gray afternoon stretched across 6 weeks. We'd gone to the ramen place as usual, and halfway through the meal he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I'd ever regretted taking the job at Averill & Cho instead of the offer I'd had from the bigger firm downtown, the one with the name everyone recognized, the one that would have paid better and looked better on a resume. I told him no, and he asked why, and I said something honest without entirely meaning to, because I would have been anonymous there. Here, someone noticed what I did. He didn't say anything for a moment. He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the table, which I'd never seen him do before, or since, and said, "I noticed before you did anything worth noticing. I noticed your application." I laughed it off, said something about him just being a good hirer, and he let me laugh it off the way he always let me redirect things when I needed to. But he tapped his fingers before he said it. I'd missed the tap in the moment. I only placed it hours later, lying in bed, running the whole lunch back like a reel. The raised eyebrow scene came a few months after that, and it wasn't Priya this time. It was Marcus, one of the senior partners. A man in his 60s who'd been at the firm since it was 2 guys and a drafting table. We were in a client meeting, the 4 of us, and at some point, Thomas deferred to me on a structural question he could easily have answered himself, the way he sometimes did. Framing it as Renata's actually the one who solved that, ask her. After the client left, Marcus lingered in the doorway of the conference room and said, not unkindly, "You let her carry a lot of your rooms, Tom." Thomas didn't answer right away. Then, She's earned the rooms. Marcus looked between us for a second, not suspicious exactly, more like a man doing arithmetic he'd rather not finish, and then just nodded and left it. I remember standing there afterward, collecting my folders, feeling like something had been said in a language just adjacent to the one being spoken, close enough that I'd caught the shape of it without the words. I had my own theories in that stretch of years about what any of it meant, and I want to lay them out honestly, including the ones I later decided were wrong. For a while I believed he simply liked being needed, that mentoring me fed something in him that had nothing to do with me specifically, and I was interchangeable with any promising 26-year-old who'd walked through the door that year. I believed that for almost 6 months, and it was, I think, a story I built on purpose, because it hurt less than the alternative. I abandoned it the week I got engaged, briefly, to someone else. I haven't told you about Daniel yet. I was with him for 1.5 years, starting in my 2nd year at the firm, and I want to include him here because leaving him out would make this story simpler than it was, and simpler than it deserves to be. Daniel was kind and reasonable and wanted to marry me, and I said yes for about 11 days before I said I couldn't do it, and I never fully explained why, to him or to myself, until much later. What I remember most clearly from that period is a single Thursday, a week after the engagement, when Thomas asked in his careful, non-asking way how things were going, and I said we're getting married, and watched him take that in without a single visible change in his face, and then watched him say, "Congratulations, he's lucky," in a voice so level it told me everything by how hard it was clearly working to stay level. I broke it off with Daniel 11 days later. I told Daniel it was about timing, about not being ready. I've never told anyone, until right now, that I think some part of me broke it off because I couldn't stand the specific quiet that had come over Thomas's face for exactly 1/2 second before he said congratulations, and I didn't want to be responsible for putting that look on his face permanently. That's the part of this story I'm least proud of, if I'm honest. I let a decision that big get shaped by a man who never once asked me to shape anything around him. He didn't know. I made sure he never knew. That was its own kind of dishonesty, I think now, not to him, but to Daniel, who deserved a reason that was actually about him. The obstacle-tested scene by the window, the rainy night I told you about, wasn't the only one. There was a second one, quieter, 1 year later, that I think matters more precisely because nothing about it looked like anything from the outside. We'd gone to a site visit together, just the two of us, out past Hillsborough, checking on a framing issue at a house we'd designed for a family with 3 kids and not quite enough budget. It took longer than expected, some question about a load-bearing wall that needed both of us on site to resolve, and by the time we finished it was dark, and the contractor had locked up and left, and we were alone in an unfinished house with exposed studs and a smell of fresh-cut lumber, waiting for a rideshare that was 20 minutes out. We sat on a stack of drywall, in what would eventually be someone's living room, not talking much, and at some point he said, without the finger tap, without any preamble at all, I think about what year this would have needed to be, for this to be simpler. I asked what he meant, though I knew. 1 year before I met Anne, he said. Or 10 years from now, maybe, if we're both still. He stopped himself, didn't finish it. Looked out at the dark shape of the unfinished doorway instead. I didn't finish it for him. We sat there another few minutes, in a silence that felt less like absence and more like something being very deliberately held in place by both of us, and then the rideshare's headlights swept across the studs, and we stood up, and neither of us ever mentioned that unfinished sentence again. I want to say plainly, I don't think either version of that sentence, the year before, the 10 years from now, was ever going to happen. I don't think he thought so either. I think he needed to say it once, out loud, to something other than himself, and I happened to be the only person he could have said it to. That's not romance. That's just what it costs a careful person to carry something for a long time without ever setting it down. 2 years after that night by the window, he retired. It wasn't sudden. These things rarely are, in a firm that size, but it still landed like something dropped from a height I hadn't measured. He announced it at a Monday staff meeting, in the same even voice he used for everything, said something about Anne's father needing more care and Bend, about wanting to be present for his sons before they were fully grown and gone, about 31 years being enough for one man to give to one profession. People clapped. Someone cried a little. Not me, though I remember concentrating very hard on my own hands to make sure of that. The Thursdays didn't stop right away. We had maybe 6 more of them, in that strange final stretch, each one a little more careful than the last, both of us aware of a clock neither of us mentioned. On the last one, he didn't remove his egg first. I noticed it and said nothing. I think now that he simply forgot for once, and I think the forgetting meant more to me than if he'd done it exactly right, because it told me the ritual had never really been about the egg. He gave me his home email address, written on the back of a business card, and said, "For when you finish the Kessler house and want someone who isn't billing you by the hour to look at it." I kept that card in the same drawer as my passport for the next year, which tells you something about how I filed him, mentally, in a place reserved for things I might need suddenly and couldn't afford to lose. I told myself, in the year that followed, a version of the relationship that I now understand was mostly a story I needed in order to keep functioning. I told myself it had been mentorship, purely, and that whatever I'd felt at the window that rainy night was a 28-year-old's confusion about gratitude and attention, easily mistaken for something else. I told myself Priya's question in the break room had been answered correctly. I told myself the second coffee cup in his drawer was nothing, was just a cup, was the kind of thing everyone has and never uses. I left Avril and Cho 11 months after he did, for a firm downtown with better pay and worse light, and the distance did what distance does. I thought of him less, then a normal amount, then only on the specific Thursdays that still, unaccountably, felt different from other days. The discovery happened 3 years after that, at a memorial service I almost didn't attend. Anne had passed, a fast illness, the kind that doesn't give people the runway they'd want, and I heard about it through Priya, who still worked at the firm and still, apparently, kept a small file in her head labeled Renata and Halloway, because she texted me the details unprompted, the way you tell someone something you suspect they'll want to hear sitting down. I went. I told myself I was going for him, as a former colleague, nothing more, and that was even mostly true. I hadn't seen him in 4 years. He looked older in the specific way that grief ages a face, rather than time. The same features, arranged with more weight behind them. We spoke briefly, the kind of brief that's appropriate at a funeral, and I would have left it there, would have driven home and let the whole visit close itself quietly, except that his older son, David, a grown man now, mid-20s, with his father's habit of listening before speaking, found me by the coffee table afterward and said something that stopped me completely. "You're Renata," he said. "The architect. Dad talked about your work sometimes. He kept a file." I must have looked confused because he kept going, gently, like he'd been wanting to tell someone this for a while, and I happened to be standing there. "When you were still at the firm, I found out about it later, going through his desk stuff last year. There was a whole folder. Every time you did something on your own, that library branch, the house you did after you left, he'd print out photos of it, articles, if there were any. He never said anything to us about it directly. My mom knew, though. She told me once it made her—" He paused, choosing the word carefully, the way his father would have. "Glad. That's what she said. Glad someone he believed in that much turned out to be right about." I didn't say anything for what was probably too long. David seemed to sense he'd handed me something heavier than he'd meant to, and excused himself back toward the other mourners. I found the drawer myself, later that week, when he asked me to help him sort through some of Anne's papers. A task I understood, even as I said yes, was really an excuse to have one more Thursday, dressed up as errand running. The folder was exactly where David said it would be, tucked behind old tax documents, unlabeled except for a strip of masking tape that said, in his handwriting, nothing but a year. The year I'd started at the firm. Inside it, printouts of 2 projects I'd led after leaving Averill and Cho, a folded page from a design magazine that had run a small feature on the library branch, and folded separately, older than everything else, its creases gone soft, the very first set of section drawings I'd submitted with my job application. The ones he'd told me on day 1 had joy in them. He'd kept the original. Not a copy. The original. I stood in that doorway longer than I've admitted. Long enough that the light outside changed, the way it does in late afternoon when you're not paying attention to anything but what's in your hands. I went through the folder twice before I said anything to him. Slower the second time, because the first time through, I don't think I actually saw any of it. I was too busy managing my own breathing. The library branch article was folded to a specific paragraph, the one where the critic had written about the way the reading room's clerestory windows handled the Northwest's particular gray light, a paragraph I remembered writing myself, in a sense, because I'd said almost exactly that to the critic in an interview, and she'd rendered it better than I had. He'd underlined it, not highlighted, underlined, in pencil, the same soft pencil he used for red lines, like he'd been reviewing my work one last time, the way he used to on Thursdays. Except there was no lunch attached to it anymore, no reason for it except that he wanted to. The house, the one I'd designed the year after I left the firm, my first solo commission, a small thing for a couple who didn't have much money and wanted something that didn't feel like it apologized for that, had 3 photographs printed from what looked like a real estate listing, the kind of low-resolution images agents use before professional photography comes through. He'd found it before it was anywhere official, before any magazine had touched it. He must have been checking, periodically, on his own, for something to check on, and underneath all of that, the original section drawings. My section drawings, the ones from my application, the actual sheets, not photocopies, meaning that somewhere, 3 years into my employment, or maybe on my very first day, he had quietly pulled the originals from the file HR would have kept and replaced them with copies, and no one had ever noticed, and I certainly hadn't, because why would I have gone looking for my own application in a personnel file I had no reason to open? I found him in the next room with a box half-packed, a stack of Anne's paperback mysteries balanced on his knee, sorting them by some system only he understood. Donate, keep but uncertain. He looked up when I came in and must have read something in my face immediately, because he set the box down before I'd said a word. "You kept these," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which I remember being grateful for. He looked at the folder in my hands for a long moment before he answered, and I watched something move across his face that I'd only seen once before, at the window, all those years ago. Not guilt, exactly, and not pride either. Something more like a man watching a door open that he'd built himself, brick by brick, specifically so it would never open, and finding that he wasn't as sorry as he'd expected to be. "Yes," he said. "Why?" I asked, and I meant it as an actual question, not a rhetorical one, even though I think some part of me already had an answer forming. I wanted to hear him build it himself, out loud, the way he built everything, carefully, in order, no shortcuts. He was quiet long enough that I almost filled the silence myself. The way I used to when we were still boss and employee, and I mistook his pauses for displeasure instead of what they actually were, which was construction. Finally, he said, "Because I didn't get to say the things I might have said if things had been different, and I wasn't going to say them anyway. So this," he nodded at the folder, "was what was left. Watching." From a distance that felt honest to what I'd decided. "Decided?" I repeated. "You make it sound like a policy." "It was," he said, without any defensiveness. "I decided it early. I remember deciding it, not the day I hired you, a few months after. I remember exactly where I was standing. He didn't tell me where. I didn't ask. Some things, even now, even after the folder, still belonged only to him. I decided that whatever this was going to be, it wasn't going to cost you anything. Not your job, not your standing at the firm, not a single thing you'd earned. And it wasn't going to cost Anne anything either. Which meant it couldn't be anything at all, in any way that counted. So I built the only version of it that didn't cost anyone. This, again, the folder. It never asked anything of you. I want you to know that clearly. I didn't do any of it hoping for something back. There wasn't a version of this where something came back to me. I understood that going in. You could have just told me you were proud of my work, I said. People do that. It doesn't require a secret file. He almost smiled, the closest I'd seen him come to one since the funeral. Would you have believed me? If I'd said it over lunch, the way a boss says it? I started to answer and stopped, because I honestly didn't know. I don't think you would have, he said. I think you'd have filed it as encouragement. This, he gestured at the folder one more time, and I understood he was going to keep gesturing at it because he didn't have better words than the object itself. This was the only version that was true enough to be worth keeping. I sat down across from him, on an ottoman that still had a price tag hanging off the underside, some new furniture Anne must have bought that spring before she got sick, never quite settled into the room yet. I asked him the question I'd been building toward without letting myself notice I was building toward it. Did Anne know? Not just. David said she knew about the file. Did she know what it meant? He nodded slowly. She was the one who told me I should keep it in a real folder instead of a stack in my desk drawer. I hadn't hidden it from her, particularly, though I hadn't announced it either. She found it the way you found it, by accident, looking for something else, years ago. She didn't ask me to stop. She asked me to be honest with myself about what it was, which I think was harder than if she'd asked me to stop. He looked down at his hands. She told me, once, that she'd rather I have one thing I never touched than a dozen things I quietly did. I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else she ever said to me. I didn't know what to do with the size of that. The fact that his wife had not only known, but had, in some complicated, generous, clear-eyed way, made her peace with it decades before I ever found the folder myself. It recalibrated something in me, sitting there. I'd spent years quietly assuming I understood the shape of what I was part of, and I hadn't understood it at all. I'd been standing at the edge of an arrangement between two people who'd built something more honest than I'd given either of them credit for. I kept the coffee cup too, I told him, mostly because I needed to say something, and it was the truest small thing I had. I told him about finding it in his drawer, looking for a stapler. Years ago, the plain white cup, never used in front of anyone. He looked briefly startled, then almost laughed. I don't even remember why I bought that, he said. I think I just wanted one thing in that office that wasn't shared with the rest of the staff. A cup nobody else drank from. He shook his head slightly. I don't think I ever used it either, now that I think about it. I bought it and put it in the drawer and never once took it out. Then, why buy it? I think sometimes you need to own a version of a thing you're not going to use, he said, just to know it's yours. We sat with that for a while, in a room that smelled faintly of cardboard and old paperbacks, and I understood that we'd just named the whole 3 years, and the file, and the cup, and the unfinished sentence at Hillsborough, in that one exchange, without either of us using a single word that would have made it into something it wasn't. Why? I asked, though I think I already understood most of the answer, and I think he understood that I understood, because he took a moment before answering anyway, the way he always did when the real reason was the one worth saying carefully. Because I didn't get to say the things I might have said if things had been different, he said. And I wasn't going to say them anyway. So this was what was left. Watching, from a distance that felt honest. He looked down at his hands. It never asked anything of you. I want you to know that. I didn't do it hoping for anything back. I know, I said, and I did. That was the strange grace of it, even in the discovery, even holding proof of 3 years of quiet devotion in my own hands. I never once felt owed anything. And I don't think he ever felt entitled to anything either. It had simply existed, the way weather exists, without needing permission from either of us. I thought, standing there, of the window that rainy night, how close we'd stood, how neither of us had moved, and I understood it differently now. It hadn't been restraint out of fear. It had been restraint as its own complete thing, chosen on purpose, over and over, because some things are worth more intact than crossed. I thought of the tap of 2 fingers before he said something real, and realized he'd done it just now, right before telling me about the folder, and that I'd caught it without meaning to. The way you catch a familiar song from another room. I kept the coffee cup too, I said, and told him about the stapler, the drawer, the white cup he'd never used in front of me. He almost laughed, the closest I ever saw him come to it that week. I don't even remember why I bought that, he said. I think I just wanted something in the office that wasn't shared with anyone else. Neither of us needed to say more than that. We both understood exactly what he meant. We didn't become anything after that week. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the truest part of the whole story. There was no confession that reordered our lives, no leaving of anything, no beginning of anything new. He was a widower, working through a grief that belonged to him and his sons, not to me. And I was a woman in her 30s who had just learned that she'd been quietly, carefully loved by a man who never once asked her to carry the weight of it. What we did instead was simpler, and I think, now, harder won. We had one more lunch, a few weeks later, at the ramen place, the old one, still there after all those years. He ate his egg first. I did too, without either of us mentioning it, and when the tap of 2 fingers came, near the end, he said only, "I'm glad you found the folder. I don't think I ever would have shown you on my own." I told him I was glad too. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. I still have the section drawings, not framed. I thought about it and decided against it, because framing them would have made them into a story I was performing for other people, and this was never that kind of story. They're in the same drawer as my passport, still, next to a business card with a home email address on the back that I've used exactly 4 times in the years since, always for something small, always answered within a day. I think restraint gets a bad reputation, in a world that mostly tells you love is only real if it's spoken, chaste, resolved. But some of the truest care I've ever received came from a man who decided, on purpose, again and again not to say it, and said it anyway, in a drawer, in a folder, in an egg eaten first, for 3 years, without once asking me to notice. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.